Thank you all for coming. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Religious Studies 2025 Smith Chase Lecture. Smith Chase is an annual event made possible by generous gifts that honor Carol Chase and H. Sheldon Smith, both of whom were long-term professors in religious studies at Elon. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Sarah Imhoff to you. Dr. Imhoff is visiting us from Indiana University, Bloomington, where she chairs the Religious Studies Department and where she also holds the J. and Jeannie Schottenstein Chair in Jewish Studies. Dr. Imhoff has received numerous awards and recognition. Internally, Indiana University has recognized her with the Trustees Teaching Award, which is given to faculty who make particularly positive impacts on students, and especially on undergraduates. Externally, her teaching has also been recognized with substantial awards from the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's also been an important leader in the American Academy of Religion, which is the flagship organization for religious studies. Dr. Imhoff is a prolific writer. The publication section of her CV looks like a chemist's. I can't list all of her work, but I want to highlight three important pieces. The first is Masculinity in the Making of American Judaism, which is a thoroughly researched and well-argued inquiry into how gender norms shape Jewish American history. She also published The Lives of Jesse Samter, Queer Disabled Zionist, in 2022, which exhumes the story of a polio survivor who made Aliyah in the early 20th century, then lived out most of her adult life on a kibbutz with a woman named Leah. Imhoff is also the founding co-editor of the journal American Religion, which over the past few years has grown into a major publication. I'm also happy to introduce Dr. Imhoff for another reason. At Elon, we like to encourage students to seek out a constellation of mentors. We mean many things by this term. One is that nobody ever has it all figured out, but when you're open to it, there will be people who are in your corner who are ready to support you in assorted ways. So you should try to find them. But we don't just tell our students to seek this out, we each have our own constellation of mentors. I count Sarah Imhoff as an influential mentor who helped me get to where I am today. When I was a graduate student at IU, she volunteered to coach me through complicated materials. Many of the things she taught me have, over time, become cornerstones of my own teaching here at Elon. Many of my regularly offered courses would not exist if it weren't for the support she offered me. So in addition to welcoming an accomplished scholar and a pedagogical leader to Elon, I'm also happy that I get to introduce a mentor and a friend. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Imhoff.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This is really lovely. This is a really meaningful invitation for me to receive for this reason also. It's so wonderful to see our students go out into the world and become major scholars in their own right. So at the Journal, we worked on a project that Andrew spearheaded recently, and it's definitely one of my favorite things that the Journal has done. So so this is a real delight for me for professional and personal reasons. There we go. All right. Can a blind boy read from a Braille scroll for his bar mitzvah? If a deaf person feels the vibration of the shofar on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, does that count as hearing it? These are live questions for Jewish communities who hold halacha, or Jewish law, as a central part of their Judaism. Scholars and community members alike have traditionally approached these questions as textual issues. Ta-da! So if you were interested in them, you would study a text such as the Talmud. That's a picture of the Talmud, but that's just the first page. It's not the one that we would actually be looking at. Or later rabbinic opinions that themselves might be engaging Talmudic materials to learn how a single person relates to the object in question. So this decision seems to hinge on whether this particular person can hear the shofar or whether this Torah is halakhically acceptable. Yet, I think when we look closer, even by reading the same halakhic discussions in the Talmud or in later materials and exploring the experience of practitioners, we actually see that the question hinges on a trio of things. The practitioner, the ritual object, and the religious community. This is the best I could do. So left practitioner guy looks to be solo, but you can tell right away that he's actually in community with the person who is next to him and everybody else around him. So that was my best attempt at a visual representation of a person is not alone. In part because of the role of text in Jewish life, it's fair to say that textual interpretation has been the main lens through which scholars have engaged Judaism and disability in general. Judith C. Abrams' foundational 1998 book called Judaism Disability has the subtitle Portrayals in Ancient Texts from the Tanakh through the Bavli, which is the Babylonian Talmud. Sol Olian explores the construction of disability through the biblical text. Rebecca Raphael and Bonnie Gracer both have work on deafness in the text of the Hebrew Bible and the Mishnah, respectively, and they use these to analyze ancient constructions of deafness and hearing in ancient Judaism and Israeli religion. More recently, too, disability has become an important topic in the subfield of rabbinic literary texts, and theoretically sophisticated work like that of Julia Watts-Belzer, Leonard Lamehouse, and Rafe Neese demonstrates this. I would say we can summarize this by looking at Abrams' introduction to a 2007 special issue of the Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health, where she writes, "A recognition of disabilities and their role in Jewish life is evident from, here we go, our earliest to our most recent textual sources. From the Torah to modern writing, Judaism takes account of persons with disabilities and their role in community." So this has been all very text-centered, and that's important. I'm not saying it's not important or useful, yet Judaism is practiced by people with bodies who interact with ritual objects and exist in communities. So that's why this talk focuses on how bodies and objects such as the shofar and the Torah scroll matter for today's practitioners of Judaism. If we use the lens of disability to look at halakha, or Jewish law, we see that halakhic rulings are not just about a single person's bodily capacities. Disability studies scholars such as Alison Kafer and Rosemary Garland Thompson have taught us that the construction of the body itself is social and political and relational, not solely individual and biological. So your body means something to you, in part because it means something to other people around you and how you can interact with your environment. Building on these insights, today I will hope to convince you that the construction of disability in U.S. Jewish religious communities today requires our attention to the text, yes, and to interpretation, yes, but also to practitioners' bodies, objects, communities, and relationships among these three. So I'm going to explore this using two examples that I've already mentioned, the question of the deaf person hearing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and the question of a blind person performing a public reading of a Torah scroll. On Rosh Hashanah, so here's the shofar example. On Rosh Hashanah, Jews all over the world listen to the sound of someone blowing a shofar, a horn made from a ram or another kosher animal's horn. There we go. This usually takes place in a synagogue where someone blows it in a series of prescribed blasts. The practice is based on the biblical phrases, a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts, that's from Leviticus, and it is a day of blowing the horn unto you, that's from Numbers. There they are very briefly. So the commandment, or the mitzvah, to hear the sound of the shofar appears in rabbinic texts too. So these are texts written from between 70 CE to the 7th century, including the Mishnah and the Talmud. Although today, most religious Jews hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, not all are religiously obligated to do this. So religious obligation is an important piece of halakha, and it will show up a lot here in our text. For most halakhically observant Jews, so that's Orthodox and Haredi Jews, women, children, deaf people, and intellectually disabled people are exempt from the obligation to hear the shofar. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to, it just means you're not religiously obligated to do it. So this raises a series of questions. Do you have to hear the shofar? Or could you fulfill the commandment by blowing the shofar instead, right? So if these are our two biblical texts, they're a little bit in need of interpretation if the question we have is like, who's obligated to do it and what exactly are you obligated to do on this day? So one question, do you have to hear the shofar or could you make the noise with the shofar instead? This also leads to the philosophical question, what does it mean to hear something? We also might ask, why have deaf people been exempt from this religious obligation? And then we might ask, is it similar to the reason that women, children, and enslaved people, for example, are also not obligated? And then this might all lead us to ask, should deaf people today be exempt? So investigating the interpretation of the text in its ancient context and also a modern one. There we go, some of our questions. Before answering those questions, a preliminary one is, who gets to decide the answer to these questions anyway? For most observant Jews, halakhic experts today are the answer. So halakhic experts today, as in the past, are overwhelmingly male rabbis, though today there are a growing number of women. A small percentage, historically as well today, identify as disabled. And for reasons that will become clearer in the course of this analysis, blind halakhic experts, especially blind rabbis, have been more common than deaf rabbis. However, Jews who are not halakhic experts, including many Jews with disabilities themselves, also participate in asking and answering these questions and doing their own interpretations. The halakhic conversation about hearing the shofar is one that happens in conversation with textual sources. The biblical injunction, as we noted, is not fully clear on whether you can hear it or you could blow the instrument instead. If the obligation is to blow it, then deafness isn't a problem at all. But most halakhic authorities throughout the ages have decreed that you must hear the shofar. The 12th century Jewish philosopher Maimonides writes that God, quote, commanded us to listen to the sound of the shofar on the first day of Tishrei. But this was actually a conversation, like, do you really have to blow it? What do these biblical texts mean? Halakhic authorities, having largely agreed that you actually have to hear it rather than make the noise with the instrument, then have a list of people who are not obligated to hear the shofar. Women, children, deaf people, intellectually disabled people, also enslaved people. But the reasons for exclusion are not the same for each group. The discussion of women's non-obligation is probably the best known in Jewish community today. The classic way that people discuss this is to say that women are exempt from time-bound, positive commandments, because women's primary religious duty is caring for women in the household. So time-bound is you have to do it at a particular time, and positive is it's a thing you have to do rather than a thing you have to refrain from doing. So like you still have to refrain from not eating these things that are not kosher, but because go hear the shofar at a particular time is time-bound, that would be a positive thing that you have to do in a particular moment. Rabbinic texts exempt young children from many religious obligations, usually citing that they don't understand or that they're too young to be held responsible for kind of things. So those are already two different reasons. Women, because they're obligated to be in the home, and children, because they don't understand. Enslaved people don't have control over their time or physical location, so it would be unfair to obligate them. Yet another category of person is not required. The shoteh, so I'm going to give you, here are the Hebrew words that appear. This person is often called the insane person. That's the word the English language halakhic literature most frequently uses. But today it's often understood to be somebody with intellectual disabilities. Leonard Lamehouse notes that from our contemporary perspective, shoteh can seem to, quote, oscillate between forms of mental disability and intellectual disability. I would also add, when you read the texts, it also seems to oscillate of something that's just more like eccentricity, like not wearing a coat when reasonable people would wear a coat. So the shoteh is a person who, this person we can say is a person who does not fully conform to social norms, but I don't think that we have a really easy modern day translation of this. But you can tell that there's an interest in the literature of not obligating somebody who doesn't fit social norms in some way. So we're already starting to see how this is very hard to do by imagining just a person in a text, but like we have a whole community that's creating those social norms. Rabbinic texts also list deaf people as not obligated. You might think the reason should be obvious. God couldn't have required that people who can't hear should hear something. And for some of today's Jewish interpreters, deaf men are exempt because of their, quote, physical inability to hear sounds. That's from one 2003 responsum about this. But for other interpreters, there's another more fundamental reason that deaf people are not obligated to hear the shofar. It's because they have been considered halakhically incompetent. That is, they're imagined not to have the intellectual capacity to understand the religious practice. So this reason is also fundamentally relational. The category of halakhic incompetence means a person can't communicate. They can't understand what others say to them, and then they can't make themselves understood by others. So that category, the herish up there, is the halakhic category for the deaf person. I'm also going to complicate this a little. It's not exactly the deaf person. Herish seems to mean, in most of the rabbinic texts, a person who can't hear and also can't speak. So some people translate this as deaf-mute. It's usually also assumed to be a person who had been deaf from birth rather than acquiring deafness later. So the herish as a category very often appears in this very list. So not just about the shofar, but other things that people are not obligated to do. The shoteh, the herish, and the katan, which is just the word for kid. So like the person who's not old enough to be obligated. So the halakhic category of herish is a category that appears, as we see, with cognitive impairments and with the child in a kind of standard rabbinic list. It's not all the time and everywhere. Sometimes we do see them separately, but we often will see this list together as people who are not obligated. And as such, I think the list implies a similarity. Each group is described as not fully competent to make halakhic decisions or to express their will or to follow rules because they can't understand. And I'll come back to this list again near the end of my talk. Modern halakhic decisions about deafness narrate a history that differentiates deafness in the past from deafness today. So when people are like having these discussions, they're like, oh, we're going to tell you a story about how deafness used to be understood in the past. One 2012 halakhic discussion begins, for thousands of years, people born without the ability to hear were erroneously consigned to mental institutions. This is not true. Mental institutions did not exist until the 18th century. It was not actually until a few, this is still the responsum. It was not until a few hundred years ago that sign language and other techniques were developed to communicate with such people and even teach them how to speak so that they could make themselves understood. You can tell how I feel about this narrative. While he's correct that officially recognized sign languages are a development of recent centuries, historically, deaf people have often used hand signals or writing to communicate. This also seems intuitive, I just have to say. The Mishnah itself explains that deaf people can marry and divorce using gestures, which undermines both this historical narrative and the common Talmudic assertion that deaf people lack comprehension. Nevertheless, this writer and many others like him, right, this is in 2012 asking this question about contemporary communities, and this is still a story that he's telling, assumes that deaf people in the past were not legally competent because they couldn't communicate their ideas or intentions to others. Most people also assume that inability to communicate implies mental deficiency somehow, even though they don't think that's true today. They think like somehow in the past, if you couldn't communicate, you must have been mentally deficient, but like we know that's not true today. Individual deaf Jews and deaf communities have also wrestled with questions about the shofar. They tend not to have that same progress narrative where things were terrible in the past, but now we recognize that they're better. So individual deaf Jews and Jewish communities have thought about these questions also beyond the scope of halakha, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Many deaf Jews, after all, practice forms of Judaism, such as Reform or Reconstructionist, in which halakha does not have a central role. So here's a cool example. Non-Orthodox deaf Jews and congregations serving deaf Jews consider the shofar not just from those halakhic perspectives, but also from affective perspective, aesthetic perspectives, and theological stances. So they ask questions like, what's the purpose of hearing the shofar? Does hearing the shofar cause the hearer to feel closer to God? Maybe to feel God's might, to feel something about God's creation, to feel a sense of awe? If so, what does it mean to hear and be a hearer? They have diverse answers to these kinds of questions, but these questions share the approach of thinking about bodies, objects, and communities together, right? What does it mean to feel something? What does it mean to hear something? When Rabbi Douglas Goldhamer held Rosh Hashanah services at his Reform synagogue in Chicago, somebody would strike a kettle drum in unison with the shofar so that congregants could feel the vibrations from the kettle drum. Another celebration included several congregants blowing shofars simultaneously, which some deaf congregants with small amounts of hearing could then hear that they might not have otherwise been able to. When Rabbi Deborah Goldman served the Beth Solomon Temple for the Deaf, she suggested that congregants just hold on to objects in the room because the objects would help them feel the vibration. Inflated balloons, which was another practice, hum with the shofar's vibration. Some congregants will actually just touch the shofar itself. It doesn't work to have, 85 people touching one shofar, but that is also an option. Congregant Florence Haberman narrated her experience as a child when she felt alienated and frankly fidgety in a hearing congregation. She said, though, then they would blow the shofar, and I immediately would hear that sound, like it was coming right to me and pulling me. It's almost like the vibrations paint a picture, she said. So she's narrating this religious experience that is within a congregation. So affective and aesthetic experience of hearing are these live questions, even for those who are halakhically observant. Those examples were from congregations where halakhic observance is less important. But here's an example of an Orthodox man whose father and son are both deaf. And he argues, deaf people have an innate understanding and appreciation of such sounds no matter what. I believe the heart intrinsically hears. He doesn't address the halakhic question of obligation or what counts as hearing in a halakhic context. Rather, he posits a relationship between the ritual object of the shofar and a metaphorical heart that hears, which he views as innate understanding and appreciation of the ritual sound it produces, right? So these are theological ideas that he is saying, this is important, and I understand deaf people to have this kind of perception that means this to them. Seen from the vantage point of the object of the shofar or the community who seeks to hear the shofar, deafness is not just a personal problem afflicting individual people. Those are Alison Kafer's words. It's about how a person is positioned in a religious community vis-a-vis others. It's about how and when that person can know and communicate their ideas with others, right? That's what do we think if a deaf person can't communicate? Does that really mean they can't communicate? If we understand that deaf people can't communicate, then we exclude them from certain halakhic practices. It's also about the material world, a human body, what that human body hears or feels, a shofar, vibrations in the air. So I think we're starting to see some of them, we need more than just a text and its interpretation, right? Okay, we're going to move on to our next example, the Braille Torah. For halakhically observant Jews, public reading from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is an obligation. But of course, to be more precise, adult Jews and in Orthodox communities, only adult Jewish men must participate in this reading. Historically, as well as today as in Yemenite Jewish communities, an adult male was called up to the Torah to read a portion of it aloud. In most Jewish communities today, what happens is an adult is called up to the Torah, but only functions as a ceremonial reader, an oleh or an olah, while a synagogue official does the actual reading from the Torah scroll. So what this does is it effectively eliminates the necessity for the ceremonial reader to have intimate knowledge of the text, right? So it means you don't have to know how to read the entire Hebrew text to participate in this ritual. So here's the halakhic question. Can a blind person read from the Torah by functioning as the ceremonial reader rather than the person who's actually reading, and thereby meet the obligation to participate in public reading for those who are listening. Although it seems like it's a question about the person alone, we'll observe that the halakhic issues include asking, what is this Torah as an object, about a Braille Torah? What does it mean for a person to read? Like, you're already asking, what does it mean for a person to read if you don't have to read to be the ceremonial reader, right? What does it mean for a person to represent a community? Because this is a public reading, and one of the things that you do when you're doing a public reading is fulfilling this obligation for all of the people who are there too. And what does it mean for an object to represent a community? We'll see how we get back to that, but the question is, how would a Braille object as a Torah scroll represent a community? So historically, there's been a significant debate about whether a blind man could serve as the ole, that's the ceremonial reader. Some argued that because he couldn't see, he would only actually be reciting, and that's not fulfilling the obligation. So if you memorize the text, that seems like most people say that doesn't count. But that was a minority view in the beginning. Most halakhic authorities agree that blind men are in fact equally obligated with other men when it comes to participation in a public Torah reading. That's really interesting to say that blind people are obligated to perform public reading, right? Super interesting. Interestingly, however, they're obligated to read from a kosher Sefer Torah, so a kosher Torah scroll, not from a Braille scroll. That's a picture of a Braille scroll. One halakhic question revolves around what it means to read a Torah scroll. So we've already had an inkling of that. For example, rabbinic texts argue that reciting a passage from memory doesn't constitute reading the Torah, even if you have the thing open in front of you. If you've got the scroll open in front of you, you still can't recite it from memory. A blind person then couldn't decide to memorize the passage and then just recite it before the community. A related question, and one that hints at the historical halakhic workarounds in the communal practice of Judaism, is whether you can repeat after someone else who reads the Torah scroll. To accommodate people who didn't know enough Hebrew or know the traditional cantillations, the practice of reading quietly or even just kind of mumbling along with the reader became commonplace. So you'd go up there with the person who was reading the scroll, but you as the reader would mumble along with or repeat along. And so for many halakhic authorities in the past and today, even quietly repeating after the Torah reader counts as a halakhically sound practice, even though reading yourself would be preferable. So in this way, a blind man can be a reader of the Torah. Moreover, one person reading from the Torah scroll can fulfill the halakhic obligation for all of the people present. So this is how participating in public reading doesn't mean that every single one of us has to come up and read, but I can discharge this obligation on behalf of all of us. Actually, I couldn't because I'm a woman. So women, for example, are not obligated to participate in this public reading. So in many Orthodox and Al-Haredi congregations, this means that women just don't serve as ceremonial readers because they can't fulfill the obligation on behalf of the community because they themselves aren't obligated. And this is a wider halakhic rule that you can only fulfill the obligation on behalf of the community if you're at least as obligated as they are, basically. So if blind men, like women, were not obligated, then they couldn't perform the reading, whether it was the ceremonial reading or the actual reading, to fulfill the obligation for the whole community. We also have the piece of the actual Torah scroll itself. So a kosher Sefer Torah, so that's a kosher Torah scroll, has been handwritten by a trained scribe with special ink on a parchment made of a kosher animal's hide. The Hebrew letters have to be written in a certain calligraphic style with particular embellishments, and the words have to appear in particular layouts, you can't just go until you get to the end of the line and restart. Thus, Torah scrolls are not just the words that are on it. They're expensive, they're beautiful, they're revered objects, and they are really important as objects, not just the written content in them. A question arose in the 1940s when Hebrew Braille became publicly available. Because of halakhic rules about the creation of Torah scrolls, a Hebrew Braille scroll is just not a kosher Torah scroll. A conservative rabbi, Daniel Nevins, for example, explains that a Braille text could be a guide to the Torah scroll, but it can't be a substitute. Similarly, halakhic authorities largely agree that you can't fulfill the obligation by reading from a printed Bible. People can and do read from Hebrew Braille Bibles and other texts, but when they're doing that, they're not fulfilling this commandment of public Torah reading. Some halakhic authorities have discussed the related question of how the Torah as an object represents the Jewish community. Historically, communities have been proud of their Torah scrolls, see the part where they're ornate, expensive, things that are a product of a lot of artisanship. The Talmud even contains a discussion about whether a person can read from an individual book of the Torah that was printed on a parchment instead of a scroll. The Talmudic discussion generally disapproves of this. And the reason here is important. It says it violates the honor of the community. So if you're just reading from a parchment, even if it has the same words as the scroll, this suggests that your community is either too poor to buy a Torah scroll or that they neglected their duty to do it and they spent their money on other stuff, right? But as Rabbinate Aliza Sperling points out, none of these reasons would apply to a person who reads a Braille text for his community today, right? Nobody's going to say, well, that community was too cheap to buy a Torah scroll, and that's why the blind person is reading from a Braille text. So she says this reasoning doesn't work. So here, and this is a debate. She says this, but other people still say no. So I want to point us to this discussion because here, the relationship of the object of the Braille Torah scroll to its reader and to the community are all things that are shaping how disability is constructed and experienced, right? Because we're asking the question, oh, does that scroll suggest that we couldn't, does that damage the honor of our community? Does it suggest that we couldn't afford something or that we didn't think it was important? Or does it suggest something else in our contemporary context? Reading publicly from the Torah also raises questions of what it means for a person to represent your community. For example, the majority halakhic opinion in Orthodox circles today is that a woman cannot serve as an olah. She can't be a ceremonial reader. They cite a Talmudic tradition about the honor of the community, here we are again, as one of the major reasons. Everyone goes up to read among the 7 who read from the Torah, even a woman, even a minor. But the sages said, a woman may not read from the Torah because of the honor of the community. So that's from the Talmud. Again, here we see that the text says, if a woman's reading publicly from the Torah, this is an honor of the community problem. Why is that true? Because they say others would assume that no men in the community were capable of it, and that's why this lady is doing it. And that would be shameful. And presumably the thing that would be shameful is that there aren't men rather than that the woman is doing it, but that's not actually unambiguous. It's also possible that the men in the community would feel ashamed of themselves if a woman could do reading that they couldn't do. Other Jewish communities have rejected this interpretation and have interpreted halakha in ways that now do allow a woman to serve as an olah. Since 1955, for example, the Committee on Law and Standards, that's conservative Judaism's official body, has allowed women to have an aliyah, although this practice took some years to catch on in individual congregations. Conservative Judaism is one where there's a lot of congregational autonomy to make these kinds of decisions about how we're going to do it here in our group. Unlike having a woman read, however, the halakhic sources never discuss a worry that having a blind person called to the Torah will reflect poorly on the community. This accords with the embodied features of the history of Jewish authority. At least 2 sages named in the Talmud, Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef, were both blind, a fact that today's halakhic authorities often mention when they're discussing disability. It's also likely that historical and contemporary Jewish communities would have been familiar with male leaders who became blind later in life. The reverence for blind male sages and historical rabbinic figures does not give us the sense that a disabled body per se dishonors the community, right? So it's not the fact of having a visible disabled person or even a disabled person in a position of authority does not seem to be the the problem, the honor of the community problem. Like the case of hearing the shofar, halakhic authorities use historical narratives to tell us about disability. In Talmudic times, each Oleh would have read his own section of the Torah. The modern Orthodox Rabbi Herschel Schechter summarized how this has changed over time. Today, in order not to embarrass those who cannot read the Torah with cantillations properly, we have instituted the practice of having a Bal Kriya, that's the reader who actually reads the portion on behalf of all of those who get aliyot. It is proper, however, for each Oleh to read softly along with the Bal Kriya from the Sefer Torah. Nevertheless, one who is blind or otherwise unable to read along with the Bal Kriya is still permitted to be called to the Torah. So you see here explicitly, blindness here is a disability because you can't perform the preferred practice of reading along softly. But it's not a disability that places the blind person in a different halakhic category. And it doesn't render their participation theologically any different. As the disability studies scholar Alison Kafer notes, disability is experienced in and through relationships. It does not occur in isolation. There we go. For these cases in US Jewish communities, we have to attend to the intertwining of the self, religious objects, and community. Yay, you remember that slide. Okay, the conservative Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, for example, connects her own experience of the material objects of the Braille text to her individual body, as well as her relationship with the community. So she says, "The technology I use to accomplish my computing needs is both unique to me and used by others. I, for example, am a Braille reader. The preservation of Braille and the importance of Braille literacy in and amongst the blind community are passions of mine. However," she notes, "no tech combination works for every person." Her experience of finding Braille texts frequently takes her to Haredi communities, who not only believe that many commandments don't apply to women, but also do not understand Tuckman's ordination as a rabbi to be valid. When she seeks a material religious object, such as a Braille Hasidic commentary, Tuckman experiences her embodied presence as a woman, as blind, in the presence of others in the Jewish community. She uses this experience as an example of both the difficulty and the importance of, quote, taking the time to build relationships across difference, even amongst our own communities. In Tuckman's account, then, we see the intertwined relationships of body, ritual, object, and community really clearly. I think that these examples of halakhic obligation make us reflect on what it means to fully participate in a tradition. It also presses us to ask, when there are exemptions from expectations or requirements, are they exclusions from full participation? Are they accommodations? Are they both? The experience of blind or deaf Jews who have been marginalized in Jewish religious communities suggests that halakha is sometimes part of the reason. Though the Talmud may provide insight into Jewish law, one non-Orthodox deaf man wrote, it failed miserably in its understanding of deaf Jews. So the halakhic conversation about who's obligated to hear a shofar or who can be called to the Torah points us, I think, to a significant theoretical point in understanding disability. Disability studies scholars have taught us that built environments and social situations can be disabling, right? Stairs are disabling if you use a wheelchair, whereas a ramp is not disabling. I would also point out that stairs are already an accommodation for all of those of us who cannot fly. Right, but our built environments are designed around what we perceive our needs to be, but then we should ask who's the we who's perceiving the needs. So stairs, high countertops disable wheelchair users in a way that ramps and lower counters don't. But I think this insight also suggests something larger and something that we might see when we combine religious studies and disability studies, maybe only by combining them, is that even religious systems can be disabling. So part of the question is halakha disabling? Or to ask that question in a better way, in what ways has a halakhic interpretation been disabling? Halakha creates categories that position certain people as less able, while also positioning some people as less obligated, which in turn, that less obligation, can mean less importance within a community. In traditional text, these categories often include deaf and blind people, people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, and people with non-normatively sexed bodies, but also women, children, and enslaved people. It's noteworthy that texts often clump these categories together. The fact that the shote and the heresh, so the insane person and the deaf person, so often show up together in rabbinic literature demonstrates the ways that these two categories were socially constructed at the time as related. The very fact that this might strike us as odd today, that you would put like a deaf person and an insane person or a really eccentric person in the same category, really reminds us about how disability is historically constructed. It's different in different times. The meaning and experiences of deafness in antiquity were not exactly the same as they are today. We can see this by observing that today's interpreters, so today's Jewish interpreters, often don't clump these groups together. Instead, they separate them and say, oh, this is the reason for these people, and this is the reason for these people. Unlike rabbinic constructions of deafness, blindness was not accompanied by default assumptions of cognitive disability. Blind Jews are generally obligated in the commandments that a sighted Jew of their gender, age, and ritual status would be. Although the Talmud discusses blindness and obligation, there's little halakhic discussion about blind men's intellectual capacities. They don't stop and say, like, but do they really understand it? No. In fact, it's assumed that blindness is a disability, but a very specific and limited one. Blindness is a disability in which you do not see, or you just really don't see well. The consensus is that blind men are obligated in commandments in the same way that sighted men, including various ritual obligations not only for themselves, but also on behalf of a family or a congregation. There are a few specific exceptions, such as the removal of the last of the breadcrumbs from the house before Passover, but all of those are really based solely on an inability to see and not an assumption of any cognitive impairment. So these differences, I think, again point to Alison Kafer's insight that disability is fundamentally shaped by the society and relationships among human bodies, social structures, and physical objects. So we can see a bit of a contrast here in the way that these texts deal with deaf people. Many people who are members of deaf communities today don't identify as disabled, and instead they see themselves as members of a culture and linguistic minority. They might point out that deaf people can and do everything that hearing people do except for hear, that they don't need a cure, and that they have their own rich culture. The only reason they face difficulty, some deaf activists explain, is because the cultural and material world we live in was made largely by hearing people. If fire alarms all flashed instead of made sounds, if telephones vibrated instead of rang, and if YouTube videos had automatic captioning, these technologies wouldn't disable deaf people. By the way, I made that entire list because those are all things that have actually happened. So the example of hearing the shofar demonstrates that deafness, however, is a disability in a halakhic context. My point here is not that deaf people who don't identify as disabled are mistaken about that, but rather that some worldviews, and here the halakhic worldview, does make deafness into a disability. One conservative responsum, so that's like a rabbinic opinion, recognized that, and it lamented, quote, the exclusion from communal activities that originated in a misunderstanding of the intellectual capacity of the deaf. So following Rosemary Garland Thompson, we might note that the textual and social representations of deafness are a large part of what is disabling. Following Kafer, we might notice that exclusion from the community, and I would add, from more theologically meaningful ritual, is itself disabling. So that's the idea that if you're not obligated to do it, and we just kind of let you do it, that your participation is less theologically meaningful for somebody who's obligated to do it and then fulfills that obligation. That kind of idea is baked into a lot of rabbinic thought. So we might say the system is disabling, or this interpretation of this system is disabling. It might sound familiar to say a system is disabling, say like a housing system or a financial system, and I'd encourage us to think about how religious systems might also be disabling. Religious authorities and institutions can often claim that these categories of people are, in fact, less able, and so the exemption from obligation is actually an accommodation. We're back at that question. The Orthodox Union website claims, so this is, you can go see this today, it should not surprise one familiar with orthodoxy that halakha is actually far ahead of the curve when it comes to disability accommodations. It continues, the reality is that some people have physical, mental, or emotional conditions that might impede one's ability to participate in certain ritual aspects of Jewish life. Halakha recognizes this reality and strikes a balance between not offering blanket exemptions and not having unrealistic expectations of people. I would note, yet not all of these exemptions are welcome accommodations. By exempting deaf, blind, or female Jews from religious commandments, the rulings exclude them from the theological meaning of fulfilling a commandment. It also excludes them from the possibility of fulfilling a mitzvah on behalf of others in their community. So even if they blow the shofar or read from the Torah, it does not have the same divine meaning as it would if they were able-bodied and male. I think this is fascinating because this kind of halakhic interpretation blurs the line between a system that disables and a system that accommodates. In one sense, then, we might read rabbinic exclusions from obligation as an accommodation of what's required. Women, children, enslaved people, and deaf people face obstacles in hearing the sound of the shofar, so they won't be required to do it. But the twin of that accommodation is taking on a lesser role in the community. This lesser role fits classic models of disability studies, such as Garland Thompson's claim that disability is, quote, the attribution of corporeal deviance. So like your body's the problem. Not so much a property of bodies as a product of cultural rules about what bodies should be or do. I think these cases of hearing the shofar and reading the Torah highlight how multiple bodily attributes, like gender, like enslavement that came up a few times, the age, disability, all participate together in the interaction of the person, the community, and the ritual object. Yay. Oh, I thought I had at the end slide. Thank you.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Do you want to field them or do you want me to field them? In the sense, do you want me to call on people or do you want to call on people?
If you've got the mic, that would be great, because otherwise
Okay.
I'm going to try to point at people and then make you follow them. So why don't you do it?
Yeah, I don't see that well. Yeah, Gracie.
So, as you're probably aware, a lot of disability exists on a spectrum. For example, deafness, like some people aren't completely deaf, or
Yeah.
people who have autism. Like, there are some that are more high support needs than others. How do you feel about that with regards to halakha? Because a lot of the examples you gave sort of felt like they existed within a vacuum. That's not a criticism of you. It's just like, I understand you had like to give quick examples. Where would you say the spectrum of disability falls within the context of halakha in the sense that it's a spectrum?
Yeah, so I would say halakha is not always good at recognizing that there is a spectrum. So halakhically, the question will be, are you really deaf? So I think that's a totally reasonable critique to say, like, wow, that's a limit of that system. There is a conversation about, like, well, how much can you hear and still count as hearing the shofar? There's also a question about whether if you use a hearing aid to hear the shofar, did you really do it? And that ends up being they decide a technical question of what a hearing aid is doing. Are you really hearing the sound, or are you hearing a sound that is reproduced in your own ear? So I would say that there are ways we could understand halakhic interpretation as disabling, and I think there are also ways we can understand halakhic interpretation as being as buying into a binary sense of are you blind or not? Are you deaf or not? So do you fit this category or do you not fit this category? And there are other times that it can be more interested in gradations, but for questions of obligation, it's just more like how does this individual person fit the category or no? Now, for many Jewish communities that are not so wedded to halakha, there can be many more acknowledgments of like, oh, well, we're somewhere in between, or like, accommodations make sense in this person for these reasons. But halakha is often more interested in the cases of like deafness. It's somebody is or isn't, except for the wiggly cases of where somebody becomes deaf later in life, right? So on the one hand, I want to say, yeah, halakha is usually interested in saying you are, you aren't. But then, of course, I can also think of these examples where it's like, oh, so-and-so became deaf later in life, and nobody thinks that means he can't express himself or he doesn't understand others. So I guess there are wiggly spots, but it's not great about like someone who is hard of hearing. That is not its own halakhic category.
All right, next question. I'm staring right into that projector. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is an area I knew nothing about before. So, and actually it calls to mind a Zen koan, actually, that asks if a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, did it make a sound, right? So, and that's, trying to break down the dualism between the perceiver and the perceived, and like silence actually is a way that kind of resolves the dualism, or that dualism collapses. So I'm wondering, is in Judaism, in the halakha, is there any perhaps inverse valuation of silence? I'm thinking of like the Amida, right? The voiceless or the unvoiced silent prayer, which I think that's like the high point of a service often, or maybe considered to be that. And I'm thinking of within the kind of sensory ecosystem of the service, right? If you read softly, right? If you kind of have that unvoiced reading, or I don't know, I'm thinking like Leonard Cohen, like the secret chord, right? The Hallelujah, right? Is there some kind of more proactive, any Jewish contemporary voices that perhaps give a more proactive or empowering reframing for those who may be hard of hearing?
That's a great question. I haven't seen them, but I also feel like this might be a question for Jeff, who is sitting in front of you. So I have not seen, for example, I have not seen any deaf Jews who say some version of there is a role for silence in contemplating closeness to God or connecting with the world around. I have not seen any deaf Jews who articulate that particularly. I would not be at all surprised to see that. Like you saw the guy who's both father and son are deaf, and he has these theological ideas about how deaf people hear with their hearts. I can imagine him in some other paragraph saying like, oh, the quietness of their world helps them more clearly connect with God or something like that. But I haven't actually seen anyone say that. There are certainly resources within Jewish tradition to value like quietness or so someone doing that would have resources to draw on, but I haven't seen anyone do it.
Other questions?
I'm interested, I guess this is a kind of open-ended question, in just hearing more about how different people within Jewish traditions, very different Jews, think about the idea of not being obligated as offensive or a limitation. I'm thinking of women. I'm thinking of any other people, and as an Islamicist, it's an interesting. The question of who is obligated to do something within Islamic law is often a question, and it's actually about authority, right? Because somebody who's obligated to do something, it's a very short step to has the authority to do something, right? And the big one in Islamic law is the obligation to command right and forbid wrong, to tell other people what they're supposed to be doing, right? It's an obligation, but
Yeah.
the question is who has to do it, right?
Yeah.
Because those people are going to have the authority to tell everybody else that what they're doing is right or wrong. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on how different groups of Jews have thought about not being obligated.
Yes, there are a variety of ways. So there are the people, let me give you a good example. Conservative Judaism decided that it was kind of going to go middle road on this and say women can be obligated if they choose to be obligated. So if you are a woman who says, I am taking on the obligation of the commandments, then you are obligated. And if you're a woman who does not do that, then you are not obligated. That's an interesting extra wrinkle, because what does it mean to be obligated if I have a choice in it? Great philosophical question. And I think that I know that there are discussions of this, and I don't find any of them fully satisfying. I think it remains an open question. Like, so is your status of obligation still the same as someone if you got to choose it and they didn't get to choose it? Within halakhic communities that don't give you the option to opt in as conservative Judaism does for women, there are varying discussions of it. So there are connections with Islamic law in the sense that enslaved people aren't obligated to do something because they don't have the authority to make decisions about their own time. And these are not the same as women's non-obligation, but women's non-obligation gets more often cast in a hierarchical sense, so that women's primary obligation, we might say, even though it doesn't count as a mitzvah in the same way, is to care for children. And so they're not obligated because it's not quite the same as they don't have the authority over their time, but it's that there's something else that the rabbis have deemed is a more important theological value than them participating in this public ritual at this particular time. And people have had varying reactions to that. Many Hasidic women will say, like, yes, God was being very thoughtful. How could I possibly do these things and raise my children? Of course, I'm not obligated. And some of them will even say, my practices here in the home bring me closer to God than any public Torah reading would. Others will say, yeah, I'm excluded from being obligated in the most important public parts of my religion, and that makes me feel like an also-ran. So you can get the spectrum of reactions to that. It is interesting to me that often people will argue, you saw in here the historical argument, like, oh, halacha says that, but that's because it was understood differently in the past, and we should understand it in this way now. So there's a continuity and an appeal to halacha while saying that we should revalue it or think of it differently. And I do think that sometimes those are connected to authority. To say in the past this person wouldn't have the authority or sometimes the opportunity to do this, but now they do. So there are a variety of answers, and there are also some other slightly, helpful differences in Islamic law. So my understanding is Islamic law has a kind of a larger set of categories. Like in halakha, you are required to do something, or you can't do something, or maybe you can do it. But Islamic law has fine. So you definitely can't do it. You shouldn't really do it. It's okay. It's recommended and it's required. And we don't have those variations. So that also means, we don't have those variations as technical kind of legal terms, but we do have some people who will say, well, if you're a woman, it's good for you to hear the shofar, which is like, it's not the same, like we have a legal category for it. So there have been some people who have said it's good to hear the shofar. Other people have said, like, well, if people can't go to the shofar should come to them. So there are other, yes, I could go on, but that was a long way of saying different people have answered that question differently, and it's not just a matter of authority, although that is one piece I would note.
All right, I think we are out of time, so let's give Dr. Imhoff another round of applause.